Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe. The fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's empire. Today is episode 22, The End of the Visigoths. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Duke Pippin had become mayor of the Palace of Austrasia due to his help overthrowing Brunhild, and was succeeded by his son Grimoald. However, Grimoald overreached when he put his own son on the throne rather than the legitimate son of the recently deceased king, and was killed by the king's brother Clovis. Austrasia and Nuestria were briefly reunited until Clovis died young and the two kingdoms were divided between his two sons. Since both kings were children, the mayors became the powers behind the throne. Grimoald's nephew Pippin II became the mayor of Austrasia and then won a decisive victory against the Neustrians at Tethry, reuniting Frankia. Pippin retained control of Frankia for several decades, while a series of weak kings served as figureheads. However, he had no clear successor when he died. Obviously, the rivals of Pippin's family saw an opportunity when he died without an heir in 714. However, before I discuss the threat faced by Pippin's family, I will examine the situation in Hispania to show why the Franks did not need to fear an invasion from the south. First, I need to review the past few decades of Visigoth history. As I've mentioned before, a series of weak Merovingian kings had come under the influence of powerful mayors of the palace. Preoccupied with fighting each other, the mayors had stayed on their side of the Pyrenees. Left alone, the various Visigoth kings had gained control of most of the peninsula, even forcing the empire to abandon its last territory in Hispania, a stretch of land along the eastern coast. Records are limited, but there do not appear to have been any major civil wars in Hispania during that period. The stability may have been to a smaller area, or the role of the nobility in the selection of each successor. Since the kings did not have a royal army, they could only rule with the support of a majority of the nobles. To be clear, there was violence, since numerous kings were overthrown in a coup, but the fighting never seemed to last for an extended period of time. Over the course of more than a century, one member of a small number of noble families would gain power and rule for a period of time. Occasionally, he would ensure that he was succeeded by his son, but no one managed to establish a dynasty. At the same time, no noble was permanently banished from the court. Admittedly, they might be exiled for a period of time, but the next ruler would inevitably restore their lands. This cycle of succession by coup occurred again when a noble named Ruderick overthrew King Witiza in 710 or 711. However, this coup seemed to have had less consensus among the nobles, which enabled a rival noble named Attila to establish his own power base around Narbonne. Ruderick undoubtedly intended to crush the revolt, but became distracted by Arab raids on the southern coast. Okay. Why did an Arab army or large raiding party suddenly cross over from North Africa? Wait, didn't the Eastern Roman Empire control North Africa? Well, the empire's presence in the region had already been shrinking even before the new Muslim caliphate conquered the Persian Empire. The two empires had exhausted themselves in several long wars, leaving the Persians vulnerable to the young caliphate formed by the Arab followers of Muhammad, who claimed to be a prophet of the same God as the God of the Christians and the Jews. The creation of Islam is a huge topic that I will deal with in another series. In short, the caliphate was closer to the Persian Empire, so the Muslims quickly conquered the Persians. Obviously, this would have been an ideal opportunity for the Eastern Roman Empire to take advantage of the weakness of its ancient rival, except the empire was exhausted as well. The Eastern Roman Empire had managed to retain most of its territory, but the defense of distant provinces in North Africa was not considered a priority, so the Muslims expanded along the coastal region of North Africa. To be honest, the conquest of North Africa was not really a long series of bloody battles, but rather a series of alliances with the local Berber tribes. The initial invasion had bogged down in the face of resistance from the Berber tribes in the imperial cities of Tripoli and Carthage. In 694, a powerful Syrian army captured Carthage and defeated the Berber priestess Kahina, concluding that it was more profitable to join the conqueror than resist. Many Berbers, including Kahina's sons, converted to Islam and became part of the ruling structure. Hassan al-Ghassani, the leader of the Syrian army, had been a bit too successful in his conversion policy, so he was viewed as a potential rival by the caliph. Hassan was replaced by Musa bin Nuzar in 704, but Musa maintained his predecessor's policy of recruiting Berbers into the army. As a result, Musa captured Tangier in 708, and he even placed a loyal Berber, Tariq bi Ziyad, as governor. By this time, Berbers likely made up the majority of the Muslim army, which explains the speed of the conquest, since there were fewer Berbers left to resist. While the Arabs had gained control over the coastal region of North Africa in a relatively short period of time, they had basically captured the main settlements and forced the submission of the residents of the surrounding region. More accurately, the residents of the surrounding region exchanged one distant ruler for another and went on with their lives. Berbers with their local followings would convert to Islam and then become clients of prominent Muslims, which explains the rapid spread of Islam in the region. Instead of discovering faith, Berbers advanced in society through the adoption of Islam. Actually, there were practical advantages since Berber converts did not have to pay the jizya, basically the poll tax that was levied on Christians or pagan Berbers. More important, the Berber converts who joined the army would be permitted to loot. This last advantage proved crucial. Like many armies that did not pay salaries, men agreed to risk their lives in exchange for the chance of wealth and land. The taxes collected by the governor of the region were insufficient to provide the financial rewards required to satisfy large numbers of armed men, so their energy and greed had to be focused outwards. Always outwards, or else the various tribes and factions would fight each other, and the recently conquered regions would break apart. Once Tangier was conquered, there was nowhere left to go in North Africa, which was a problem. The Berbers had converted and joined the caliphate's army because they felt that it would benefit them financially. Fortunately, there was a pristine, unconquered territory that could be seen when the sky was clear: the Iberian Peninsula, 14 kilometers away. Displaying considerable initiative, Governor Tariq crossed the strait in 711. The Visigoths were defeated and King Roderick died in the battle. Honestly, there are no detailed records of the battle, so all that is known is that Roderick's army was crushed and he died in the fighting. Regardless, the Arabs realized that the Visigoth kingdom lacked leadership and elevated the raids into an official conquest. The Muslim governor had probably intended to gather some loot and then return home with stories of his victory and memories of sightseeing. Instead, the massive victory encouraged Tariq to make himself comfortable on the peninsula, which proved surprisingly easy. As Tariq advanced north, he encountered little resistance, enabling him to spend the winter in the Visigoth capital of Toledo. Even so, the question remains, how did the Visigoth kingdom fall so quickly? The answer is simple. Secure on the peninsula, the Visigoths had not faced a major enemy for generations. Aside from several brief coups, the main external threats had been imperial attempts to gain footholds on the eastern coast and occasional Frankish invasions in the north. Neither rival had ever made a serious attempt to invade, but every Visigoth king would have become accustomed to preparing to defend those regions, not the south of the peninsula. In fact, it needs to be stressed that the Visigoths were not an expansionist kingdom, which was probably appreciated by their neighbors and the generations of parents who did not lose sons in needless wars over someone else's land. All of these factors played a role, but the primary factor seems to have been a lack of unity among the ruling families, since they did not combine to drive out what was probably a large raiding force, not an army. Roderick's death in battle with those raiders may have been unexpected, but the key point is that the network of noble families failed to select a replacement and then unite behind that successor to resist the Muslim invaders. The regional nobles had been shut out of the power-sharing process for at least 2 generations, so some leaders made agreements where they bent the knee in exchange for keeping their lands and local authority. Following Roderick's death, no one seems to have united the Visigoths against the invaders. In fact, there seems to have been little popular resistance. People either fled to remote regions, hoping to wait out the invaders until they went home, or they simply submitted, since the Muslims offered generous terms and let local lords keep their lands. This was a fair deal, since they would lose everything if they fought and were defeated. Also, the Muslim leaders married into the local nobility. Both Ruderic's widow and his daughter married powerful Muslim leaders. By this time, news of the astonishing victory had reached Tarik's superior, Governor Musa, at Kairouan, which is located in modern Tunisia. Honestly, it sounds like Tarik deserved a promotion, or at least an extremely favorable performance review. However, Governor Musa took a dim view of free-thinking subordinates. Remember, Musa had overseen the conquest of North Africa, and the conquest had been so speedy partially because the captives had converted and joined the family networks of their captors. As the patron networks grew, some converts would develop their own independent goals and act on their own initiative. In fact, Musa was probably promoted to governor because the caliph feared that his predecessor was too ambitious and had planned to use the new members of the family networks loyal to him to gain more autonomy. Tarik's conquest of Hispania seemed to be ideal for a similar situation, so Musa raised his own army and traveled there to make sure that Tarik did not keep everything for himself. Caramona and Seville fell relatively easily, but Merida resisted fiercely until it had been battered into submission in July 713. Moving to claim as much territory as possible before Tarik grabbed it all for himself, Musa sent his son to the Murcia region, where the local leader, Duke Theudemir, negotiated autonomy and freedom of worship in exchange for a modest but regular tribute. Actually, Theudemir is an excellent example of a Visigoth noble who survived the invasion with most of his lands, which shows why the conquest of the Visigoth kingdom was relatively fast. Once Merida had fallen, Musa met with Tarik at Toledo. The initial encounter was probably tense, but they managed to come to some agreement since they spent the winter together and then campaigned together in the spring of 714. Actually, Musa had already received a summons from the caliph to return to Damascus to give a progress report, but he made the risky decision to ignore that summons because he knew that the peninsula was only half conquered. If the Muslims stopped, the Visigoths might organize an effective resistance and might even drive them back across the water. Instead, Musa and Tarik divided the remaining regions between them and pressed on. By the fall, they had conquered the rest of the peninsula. The Visigoths largely disappeared as a political entity. Honestly, it is a good question how much cultural connection they had with the Visigoths who had entered Italy under Alaric several centuries earlier. Unlike the Vandals, who had basically ceased to exist after they were conquered by Belisarius, some Visigoth nobles followed the example of Theudemir and kept their lands and did not convert, but bent the knee and paid taxes. Other Visigoths held out and avoided conquest, protected by distance and harsh terrain. While we know it happened, unfortunately the contemporary accounts of the invasion have been lost, so we have to rely on accounts written 2 centuries later. The reliability of the accounts is further complicated by legal issues. Basically, if the lands on the peninsula had been conquered, Islamic law meant that they belonged completely to the conquerors. But if they had been surrendered peacefully, then the inhabitants could retain them, and they could only be acquired by Muslims through inheritance, purchase, or conversion. So there was a great deal of pressure on later chroniclers to justify the current lord's possession of lands by claiming that they had been conquered. However, the basic facts are confirmed by Latin sources. So Visigoth Hispania soon became part of the caliphate, if a very distant frontier province. However, neither man lived to enjoy the spoils of conquest. When Musa and Tarik finally traveled to Damascus to answer the caliph's summons, they knew that their tardiness had potentially fatal consequences, so they brought tribute, including thousands of slaves and enough treasure to require 100 mules for transport. They were near the capital when they learned that the caliph was dying, and his brother Suleiman ordered them to delay. This delay seems strange, except Suleiman wanted both the credit and the treasure for himself. The two generals may have disagreed, or they may have become inconvenient due to their fame. Regardless, they were accused of keeping the treasure for themselves, even though they had brought the treasure to the capital. Anyway, they disappeared from the historical record, which is never a good sign. It is unknown why the caliph would have punished Musa when he finally reached the capital, but he was likely concerned that his subordinate had become too powerful, especially since Musa had installed his sons as governors in North Africa and in Hispania. While the Muslims from North Africa had conquered Hispania, the actual size of the invading army is unknown. Clearly, they were enough to replace the Visigoth aristocracy. Since the conquerors were Tariq's followers and Musa's followers, they were different clan groups among the new aristocracy. Cordoba became the new capital because it was located near several trade routes, and the new arrivals were attracted by the fertile farmland in the region. Unsurprisingly, people from the same tribe settled near each other. Although many Arabs had come from Jordan or Palestine, most were from Yemen, but they were second or third generation immigrants to North Africa, so they had little attachment to their ancestral lands. Like other conquering foreigners, they married into the local aristocracy. Even so, it would be inaccurate to state that the Muslim caliphate was actively involved in the newly acquired territory. Admittedly, the caliphate sent officials to govern the peninsula, but if they tried to interfere in local affairs, they would be forced out. However, no member of the new local Muslim elite attempted to carve out an independent realm from the caliph, so the peninsula was basically left alone. To sum up, the new Muslim caliphate had conquered North Africa, which had been controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire. Unlike the empire, which had loosely governed the region, the Muslims continued to expand. An expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar to the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula proved surprisingly successful when the Visigoth king died in battle. The major Visigoth nobles failed to unite behind a successor, so the Muslims were able to conquer most of the peninsula in a few years, replacing the Visigoths as the rulers of Hispania. Meanwhile, Frankia had been reunited by Pippin, the mayor of Austrasia. However, Pippin had died without an adult heir, so who would succeed him as mayor? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.